Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Melanie Boncillon, and I'm very excited to be introducing our incredible panel of speakers today. We have Mike Bostock, the creator of D3, former graphics editor for the New York Times, and now the CTO of Observable. Dr. Jessica Holman is a professor at Northwestern University. She is an advocate for data-driven science, and her research focuses on reasoning, uncertainty representations, and interactive data. Dr. Sheila Carpendale is an artist and a computer scientist. She's a professor at the University of Calgary. Her research interests are at the intersection of information visualization and interactive art. Dr. Alvida Otley is a professor at WashU. She leads the Visual Data Analytics Lab that I'm very happy to be a part of. Her research focuses on personalized and adaptive visualization systems. Give it up for our panel.
Thank you. I have one correction. Sheila is not at Calgary. She's now at Simon Fraser University. All right, so my name is Alvida Otley, and I am excited to moderate this panel. I wanted to start with just an introduction and give you an idea of why we decided to do this panel. And so advances in technology are rapidly changing how we design, develop, and use data visualization. As a result, we are now using visualization to communicate to a broader audience, highlighting new challenges. So we've seen some recent research that suggests that visualization is being used to both intentionally and unintentionally mislead the viewer, like other communication medium. And of course, we already knew this, but greater integration of visualization into public discourse mean greater impacts. And so we need to think about what our role as visualization researchers is in terms of dealing with this. We also see that more people are interacting with visualizations using cell phones, which increases the need for responsive designs and different solutions. In some cases, we are now actually aware of who our visualizations are excluding. So most notably, visualizations are not good for people who are visually impaired. But there's a lot of research that talks about people with low cognitive skills and how our visualization designs don't necessarily work for them. Also, most of our designs are 2D representations. And so even as the volume and complexity and dimensionality of our data sets are growing, we're still limited to two dimensions. So in this panel, we're discussing solutions to these problems. And also, we want to think about how, what things might look like for the future of visualization. The goal here is not to predict future events, but I hope that our panelists can comment on what directions they believe should drive visualization research and practices. First, I'm going to start with a round of introductions and position statements. Then we will have 5 discussion points that I'm going to give to the panelists, and then we'll end with a Q&A, so you get an opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. With that, let's start with introductions. I'm going to begin with Duncan, CNC's top on the screen, and I'm going to hand it over to him for a brief 2 to 4 minute position statement.
Thank you so much. Hi, folks. My name is Duncan Gear. I'm an information designer living in Sweden, and I mostly work on climate and environmental topics for nonprofits, but I'm also the co-host of the Loud Numbers Data Scientification podcast and one of the founders of the Elevate Data Design community. So yeah, over the last couple of years, I have been exploring data sonification. And just like visualization is the process of turning data and information into images, sonification is the process of turning data and information into sound. Now, you might think that's kind of a weird niche concept, but actually sonification is all around us all the time. Because the ringtone on the phone is a sonification. So if the beat of a supermarket checkout is manipulating the items being correctly scanned, so is a guided counter measuring radiation. But I think my favorite example of all are the heart rate monitors that you find in hospitals, the ones that go beep, beep, People when a hot spot, it goes beep, and everyone panics and rushes around and the hot sound. And I like carbon monitors as an example because they very effectively demonstrate two reasons why I think solidification should be part of the future of visualization. And the first reason is the kind of ambient awareness that you get from solidification. Obviously, most hardware monitors come with a visual display, but doctors don't spend their time looking at that visualization. The solidification allows them to focus on their patient or their paperwork or something else, while still being able to be alerted or able to turn around and look in closer detail at the visualization if the patient's heart rate becomes irregular or worse. And that solidification can also reach them if they have temporary or permanent visual impairment. Solidification is a hugely useful accessibility tool. And then the second reason is the emotional impact that sound can deliver. Humans tend to have strong emotional associations with music and sound, and some of them are very cultural and some of them are very universal. So hearing a guide camera, for example, gives an immediate feeling of danger or a hazardous situation. And hearing a heartbreak gives you a sense of tension or worry because somebody is sick and it's serious, right? Then you've got maybe like a church organ, which is more spiritual and peaceful, or you have like an airfield, which lets things party time. And there are tons of other benefits of use of sound. You've got the ability to double encode people and variables, the ability to reach people through supercomputers that we all have in our pockets, which all have stereo speakers. You have the ability to take your user out of their current environment and immerse them into a new one. So if you're in the business of telling stories with data, then I think you should absolutely think about experimenting with sound and with sonification. It's able to deliver a real impact to storytelling, but a visualization alone can't really compete with, you know? A sound can get so loud that it's impossible to ignore, or even so loud that it hurts. You could really have a bar chart that's so long that it hurts. And to be clear, I'm not making an argument that all visualizations can be sonifications. There are plenty of situations where a visualization is absolutely more effective. What I'm arguing for is a world where they are paired together more often. I've learned over the last couple of years of work on sonification that the combination of sound and vision together can be really, really powerful and compelling in the context of data storytelling. And it's that combination that I believe is part of the future of visualization.
Thanks, Duncan. I definitely agree that Thanks, Duncan. I definitely agree that we need to definitely think about how to integrate sound into visualization, especially both as a way to expand our channels of communication, but also as a way to augment visualization. I'm going to now hand it off to Sheila, who's next on my screen, and I would love to hear what her thoughts are about the future of visualization.
Right. Okay. Yes. Well, just as Duncan did, so I'm realizing that manufacturing company that I should have built and brought some further and say manufacturing experience on there. And I've been doing visualization, information visualization, data visualization for quite a long time now. You know, for 5 years. I found that more and more I've been shifting towards the whole notion of empowerment. But recently I sort of actually think that I also actually approached this from the notion of our data heritage. I have realized more and more that we as humans have been using data forever. Actually, before we had written language, we were the wonderful just human artifacts is a scratching of the bone that they now use on tracking condenses. And it's 3,000 years before we had written language. We assumed we're using data to make sense of our world. And now we're worrying about, people, can they understand it? And I don't think that's the issue at all. I think that what we have is just like an industrial revolution, we have this data revolution. And the servers that we're using, big data and the fact that we are alienating people from what's part of their natural way of thinking about the world. And then what we need to do is figure out ways of reconnecting people and so that they can actually see what we're doing. I think that empowerment is not teaching them the way we do it, but helping them discover that they're actually still doing it, and that when they actually realize the relationship between what they do and what we do, they can start to make sense of it. Just one more little example like that. If you were reading an invention novel and the protagonist gets thrown into a dungeon somewhere and it's, everything is dire and it's all terrible and you're wondering about how they're going to possibly survive and keep their sanity, the author will most likely have them scratch the passing days on the wall of their prison. And we all think, yes, that will not be the same. They are still, they're tracking their data, and that's part of how we are as humans, how we think and how we relate to this world. Data is super important to all of us, and we all do it. In fact, I think the Smithsonian has over 6,000 images of people from all over the place scratching passing days on the walls of themselves. So it's something that we all do. It's just, it's not just, it's actually, I think, a physical challenge, but it's helping people realize that what we're doing is actually part of this same process and helping people reconnect with their own understanding of how to understand the world they're related to what we're doing. And I think that's the need for that.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. I agree. I feel like to some extent we've alienated a lot of people and we think of visualization as this novel new invention, but you're right, it's been around for longer than I've been around. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Mike now because I'm excited to hear about what he thinks of the future of visualization.
Hi, I'm Mike Bossack. As I mentioned, I created V3, which is a low-level library for visualizing data with web standards. Also created and still working on Observable Plot, which is kind of upgraded visualization libraries. Plot is a higher-level abstraction for supporting exploratory visualization and analysis. I was once a representative at the New York Times, and now I'm the co-founder and CTO of Observable, which is a collaboration platform for data analysis. As someone who creates tools for visualization, I'm often painfully aware how the design of these tools affects what people build with them, by making certain tasks easier or harder, by choosing defaults, by limiting or not limiting what choices users, creators can make. I believe that better tools can help people analyze, visualize, and communicate more effectively. But I also believe in preserving creative freedom, allowing users to draw outside the lines and go beyond filmmakers' limited imaginations. And I'm wary of tools for taking too many decisions away from users, presupposing certain solutions or designs. Despite knowing the importance of tool design and the effect that it has on behavior, I still find it very difficult to know how tools design will affect usage in advance. To design tools in intent to produce better outcomes. We often don't know until people start using exactly what effect it will have. It can also be surprising. For the future, I see visualization as being increasingly ubiquitous, expected, taken for granted, even mundane. Already, it's on my phone, it's on my watch. I noticed the other day, my son's animators with cameras. They have little line charts on them. This is labeled, but there's something on my chart. I see it as an essential part of our language whenever we think or talk or write about data, which these days is all the time. I think what this means is that tools for visualization have to be practical and approachable as well as powerful. We can't treat visualization as something that is special, precious, and limited only to experts. We should seek to improve visualization, not just in theory, but in practice, as it is commonly done in the real world. It's not just about pushing the envelope of what's possible in the lab or in the screen. And we also should think about visualization as a supportive medium rather than the end goal in itself. Right? So it's less about kind of the big fancy hero is and more about humble charts adding value wherever they can help us understand or communicate. My provocation there, maybe I was asked to provide a provocation. Maybe we should think less about kind of building the next great visualization tool and more about thinking how we integrate visualization tools into the broader workflow of analyzing, transforming, communicating, and collaborating with data.
I love that. Thanks, Mike. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that with the next questions. But I'm going to allow Jessica to introduce herself and talk about what her vision is for the future of visualization.
Great, yeah. I hear myself echoing. I guess I'll just go with it. Okay, so yeah, I think VisComm and the Dean or Maggie Associate Professor of Computer Science at Northwestern University. I've been doing visualization for maybe 10, slightly more years, I guess, maybe 12 years. And so I want to, I guess, in my position statement, pick up a little where Mike just about visualization as a means to an end, or visualization as something that fits into some broader workflow. My position when I think about what to say in a visualization communication workshop is one of the points I want to make is that I think we tend to think about visualization-based communication and analysis as very separate things. And I think we, as a result, are sort of thinking of these things differently, and we don't want to clear about what our goals are and whether there's any sort of common structure between these things. I think we're often a little bit actually effective for whatever the broader decision-making process or workflow is. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot in the last couple of years is, how in order to make more effective visualizations, either for communication or analysis, we really need deeper theory. As researchers, I think we do because we're the ones building the visualization tools. So either communication tools, visual analysis systems. I think we really need to sort of have theories or modeling frameworks even, and I think some exist already, where we can sort of actually model, what is the role of the data visualization in this decision process, and how then can we think about designing the visualization to be more effective in that process. So I'll say a few things about more specific underlying frameworks that I think could be very, very helpful in both uniting analysis and communication, but also in giving us a better sense of sort of what objectives we might be shooting for. One is this idea that, visualization and effective visualization, whether we're talking about communication or analysis, is often one that in some way aligns the data with our expectations so that we can sort of check our expectations against what we see. So I think we've often treated visualization as this process of like taking data, designing a chart, and the user is sort of this blank slate that's going to take in this chart, whether they're an analyst or someone receiving, some communicative visualization. And I think there's this alternative idea that we could adopt that sort of, is inspired by things like Bayesian cognition, the fact that we're always updating our beliefs, the fact that we have prior beliefs and expectations, that we could adopt, which sort of says that a good visualization is one that helps you check some model that's in your brain. So the model is sort of your understanding of how the data were generated, your understanding of what you should see in a visualization. And so we want to, know what the model is in order to design the better visualization. So I've written a little bit about this, but the point I wanted to make here is just that I think, both in communicative visualization and in analysis, there often is some implicit model when we're communicating through visualization. It's like the designer, has some message they want to get across. But I think we should, we could gain a lot by thinking about that message as sort of
some comparison between the expected and the observed data. And so I think once we start to think about it that way, we become much more sensitive to all the ways that, visual choices, like how do you scale axes, et cetera, sort of subtly change this implied comparison that someone is doing. And I think uncertainty and the role of sort of data for supporting reasoning under uncertainty is critical to all this as well. So yeah, the idea that a good visualization is a model check is something that I believe strongly in. More broadly, I think the way I increasingly think of visualization, which I think helps structure my thinking about it and my ability to see sort of how to make it better is based on kind of an underlying framework from decision theory. So, rather than just thinking about these data samples that we're visualizing as sort of occurring in isolation, decision theory sort of models a process in which we're using data by saying, there's always some uncertain state of the world that we're trying to form beliefs about. We might have prior beliefs about that state of the world, but we also get data sampled from some process that helps us, inform our beliefs about the world. We often want to make some decision based on what we believe, and I think we've sort of shied away from this in visualization communication in particular. We think like we don't know what decision someone's making when we show them this newspaper graph, but I would argue that often there is some implied decision, at least downstream. And so in decision theory, we're concerned with this decision that's being made based on samples, giving us information about some uncertain state of the world. And we have some payoff or utility function that says like, how much, does it matter if we make the right decision in this situation? And so, this might sound kind of, formal or academic, but I really think that without sort of some sort of framework to think about like what is the role of visualization, and not just as this standalone thing, but in a bigger decision process. I think we need that to sort of get further in terms of knowing whether we're on the right track as researchers. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Jessica. That is the perfect segue into the first question that I have. How should we think about the role of visualization in society? Are there emergent visualization usage scenarios that you think researchers and designers should pay attention to? I'm gonna throw this to Duncan.
Sure, okay. Yeah, I think one interesting emergent visualization scenario that I find particularly interesting is the world of video games. The video games are kind of packed with visualizations. They're all over the place, and more people are playing games compared to, 20 years ago or something like that. And I think that this has a couple of quite interesting implications. I think first is that it puts visualization in this interestingly playful context, one which very much encourages interactivity and experimentation. I think it's also undoubtedly been part of the huge rise that we've seen in visualization literacy in the last couple of decades. And it's kind of funny, in Tufte's in Envisioning Information, there's a line where he's railing against chart junk, and he says something like, who would trust a chart that looks like a video game? Whereas actually over the last 20 years, hundreds of millions of kids all around the world have learned how to read visualizations by playing video games. And so I think it's worth researchers and designers maybe paying a little more attention to how games communicate what can sometimes be extremely complicated information and data.
Thank you, Duncan. Sheila, do you have anything to add?
Mute myself here. I would kind of like to continue on from the theme that Jessica raised, though you didn't actually name it as a semiotic approach. Essentially, what you were talking about is a semiotic way of thinking about communication, where one way of thinking about communication is that the author has kind of all the power that we when we are authoring something, be it with words or be it with visuals, that we are trying to format it in the right kind of way so that the message will be delivered as understandable. But if you think about it as semiotic, which I think is much more how it happens in the real world, the author and the reader have pretty much equal responsibility. Like if the reader doesn't bother to really look at the words or think about them, then not much communication is going to get through, no matter how well they phrase them. Like, so we are in this situation where where we need to think about how people are grappling with what we are giving them. And I think that we're in a better situation than usual because of the possibility of interaction. Now, I think that you can see that a lot when you actually make a physicalization, because in being able to manipulate it in our fingers, a lot of our understanding for many of us comes from kinetics. So that can help a lot. But we have interaction digitally. And I think, though, I would have to actually look for, I mean, because I've only really seen things in video games looking over people's shoulders. I'm not really a player myself, but I think that they are particularly interactive, and they are relating very directly to what's happening at the time, and they are changing appropriately. And they're not a static thing. They're part of dynamics. And I think that is that bringing the dynamics in I don't know, I want to kind of say, like in a kind of more visceral way that you can feel it, is probably something that is very useful to sort of help the reader. When, I mean, I think back to when we did that study about, active reading of visualization, because we were riffing off how people who are working with children who are having trouble with regular reading of words in text, they develop all of these kind of processes, which they call active reading. And in watching people try to cope with visualizations, they are doing this same kind of active reading. And I think that we could incorporate the ability to have those kinds of actions on the fly way, which is something that we can code for, that we can include, to put more emphasis on how integrated and immediate the response is. I think that thinking about how to really read, to really understand, we really need the reader to be able to be active, and then we have to actually give them the means to be active. I even think that what Duncan was saying about sound and integrated sound and visuals is the same. It works if the sound is immediate, if it actually connects directly to what you're seeing, to what's moving. So it's a way of actually kind of bringing more information to more of our senses.
Thank you, Sheila. Mike, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, a lot of what Sheila and Jessica resonated with me too. I think it's too easy or convenient to think of visualization as this unbiased act, mapping abstract data into visual channels to facilitate representation, or to facilitate perception, sorry. And I think in the context of society, we should think about it instead more as language, right? As this medium that is shaped intentionally and unintentionally by the author, that incorporates both purpose and bias. I once heard somebody say that each visualization embodies a hypothesis, right? This idea or theory that can be confirmed or rejected by what you see. And so I think that means whenever you look at a visualization, you have to interpret it skeptically, right? You have to consider who the author is, what they're trying to tell you, what conclusion they might want you to draw, and why. I think, one hallmark of a good explanatory visualization is that it makes this intent explicit. It tells you in words, like in the title, in annotations, what it's trying to show you. I think that for me, that was like probably the biggest lesson that I learned making graphics for the New York Times. It's never enough just to visualize the data, no matter how pretty or compelling it may seem. If you can't say something interesting about it, something specific that you can put into words, it's not worth publishing. So I think, visualization tools in particular have a ways to go to make that easier, making annotation easier.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm really glad you brought up New York Times, because the next question that I want us to discuss is, how do we make visualizations more beneficial to more people, and who benefits? Jessica, do you want to start with this one?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think in terms of, making them more beneficial to more people, I think there's areas that are particularly important right now related to that. So accessibility obviously is one way that people are trying to broaden, the accessibility of visualizations to broader audiences, people who have visual impairments, et cetera. One that we've been working on in my lab, and specifically my PhD student Hyuk Kim has been pushing a lot on, is responsive visualization. So, I think we've, for a long time as a community, sort of ignored the fact that so much visualization is occurring on smaller devices, mobile phones, et cetera. And so I think, we have to be investing a little more heavily in tools for responsive visualization design. Things like grammars, which we've developed one in my lab to represent responsive transformations. And then authoring tools, et cetera, to help, the designer's goal or the designer's task has kind of gotten a lot more complicated, because now rather than just designing one or two versions of a visualization, you're faced with designing, so many. And so things like authoring tools that can make recommendations to authors, et cetera, I think are one way to sort of broaden, the access people have to good visualizations. I also think, in terms of making visualization beneficial for more people, and people who maybe wouldn't be benefiting as much necessarily, I don't have a really clearly defined viewpoint on this, but I would say Evan Peck did some interesting work a few years ago looking at how people in rural Pennsylvania interpreted visualizations. And I think, in visualization, when we're trying to be sort of, more open and thinking more about general audiences, we usually stop at crowdsourcing platforms. But I think the kind of work that Peck and his colleagues did is a great example of what we should be doing more of, which is actually going out and working with different populations and trying to understand how they're using visualizations, and how much of what we think we're getting across is actually sort of the way in which they're interpreting things. So yeah, those are some various ideas related to sort of broader uses.
Thanks, Jessica. Mike, I know that you mentioned that we probably don't need any new tools, so I'm curious about what your thoughts are in terms of how do we make them more beneficial to more people.
Well, I think annotations, again, is a big part of it. I think the responsive annotations often end up being one of the trickiest things to do as well, just because fitting words in there, whether you have lots of different display resolutions to deal with, is very difficult. And sort of doing the text wrapping, making sure it doesn't conflict with other visual elements you're trying to show, is a big challenge. And I think that those annotations are nice. They make the visualization good for non-visual readers as well, that are able to get that. And it's actually, adding editorial information to the visualization, something that is not going to be there with just the sort of visualization alone. It's adding information that wouldn't otherwise be available. I think for the question of, visualization, making it beneficial to more people, I also think there's something about the basics, or just helping people get the basics right, that we could still make some improvements with. I think people love to complain about the rainbow color scales, but one of my pet peeves is time series ordinal bar charts, right, where you have bars over time, but you have an ordinal axis. And so why is that bad? Well, if you have missing data, they end up being missing from the domain of your ordinal scale, and sort of the void just gets collapsed. It gets filled in by the adjacent bars. And the only way you would notice if there's missing data is by reading sort of the individual ticks on that axis and noting that there's an irregularity, that there's a gap in the data. And so sometimes I think, how can we help these kind of core concepts of visualization, like this idea that you have different types of data that can be nominal, ordinal, quantitative, or temporal. How can we make that sort of more at the forefront of visualization design, rather than just sort of thinking about what shapes or what the appearance of what you want to create is, helping people really think about what the meaning is that they're trying to convey in this visualization.
Thanks, Mike. Sheila, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think to begin with this, I think that our focus, in fact, the whole of technology's focus on generalization has actually been a real part of the problem of alienation. Like if you think about any other products that we have in our lives, we don't generalize. We don't think that everybody will drive exactly the same car, or that our houses should look exactly the same, or that we should wear the same clothes. We don't like the notion of uniforms. And yet somehow or other, from the early 80s, we've accepted this for technology, and that includes visualization. There should be a right visualization that's best for everyone. And I just don't think that's true. It's not true for any kind of communication. And if we're really thinking about visualization as communication, we should think about that variations are good, useful, and empowering, and that we should think about designing more for the individual. And that doesn't mean that I'm supporting the notion of, like usually when you talk about this, people think, oh, she means end user programming. I think, oh my goodness, no. If I buy a new car, I don't want to assemble it myself. Thank you very much. I want to buy the one I like. I want to, and same thing for a visualization. Why do we assume, why is that the best way to kill a novel visualization, to say, but is it generalizable? And the person doesn't usually, of course not. None of them are. I mean, I think that we know now that they're not generalizable if you are visually impaired in some way, but they're lots of times not generalizable to different cultures, different ways of thinking, different ways of knowing. There's all kinds of variations in humanities that get ignored by the fact that we keep focusing on generalization. I mean, and I think we'll go back to all of that notion of how we validate things and how we look at what we approve and what we don't. I think that it's high time that we go for a little more realism and leave the generalization idea as, I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on about it. I actually think it's been like a really important part about how our whole economics has got so unbalanced that tech wants all of us to use the same type of technology. And we have, the differences between the technologies that you can use are actually so minute at this point. And many of us don't really want to be, pigeonholed into the same way of looking at things. Let's try and actually be more inclusive by exploring the richness. Like, we don't want all of our plays, all of our poetry to be exactly the same. And I think that we need to kind of think that communicative visualization can be more on that kind of plane, that we are communicating best to a particular group of people that may actually shed insight into other groups of people, but that we don't actually have to make it for everybody. We have to make it real for a real group.
Yes, I love that. And I do think that we need more research into individual differences in visualization. I know, Duncan, this is near and dear to your heart. I'm curious about what your thoughts are in terms of making visualization more beneficial to more people.
Yeah, I mean, largely, I just very much agree with what Sheila just said. I'd love to see more languages, being able to be supported by the tools that we have. I'd like to see our work be informed by more cultures and more generally accessible. I mean, when Mike was talking about annotations just now and how it's difficult to fit words on a page, I was just thinking, we've got sound. Like, all the devices that we use have sound, and sound doesn't take up space on the screen at all. So I think that can be a really, really powerful tool in some situations, and it's accessible too. One of the big benefits of sonification is that it works really, really well for people who are, obviously who have temporary or permanent visual impairments, but also one thing that doesn't get talked about enough is that it also works really well for people who are distracted or not able to look at a screen at any given time, you know? So it works in a situation like a podcast or a radio, but even in a visual situation, like I'm sure there are probably people watching this talk right now who aren't actually like looking at the screen. They're just listening, you know, maybe while they do their laundry or look after their kids, or maybe they're in a different browser tab or on Twitter or something like that. And a visualization does none of those people any good, whereas a sonification could reach them. So I think that there are definitely ways in which you can integrate sound in this, but I'm going to try not to be all one note and just talk about sound the whole time. I very much want to echo what Sheila was saying around having more influences from more cultures on visualization and making it so that we don't have one visualization for everyone, that we personalize it for different audiences, and we know who those audiences are.
Thank you. I'm going to skip to our final question so that I can give the audience time to ask questions as well. So the final question is meant to be fun and imaginative. And so I'm curious about, what is your fantastical vision of visualization? Let's go with Mike first.
Well, I guess my answer to this was that I want it to be less about code, I guess. I do feel like I spend a lot of time writing code and thinking about programmatic interfaces to visualization because they end up being the most expressive way of getting what I want. But I'm also frustrated by them, and I feel that it's awkward to have to keep switching back and forth between this abstract representation, you know, where you're manipulating symbols, and this visual representation, and the two things feel detached. And in particular, when you think sort of more broadly about, it's not just about visualization, it's about data transformation and analysis, you know, and you have these tables and you want to pivot your table from wide to tall, or you want to filter things, or you want to sort things. You know, like, how could we take these concepts that have had so much success in the programming space, right, in the Grammar of Graphics School of Visualization Tools, and make those sort of more, you know, direct manipulation, more graphical interfaces for doing that, so that I can have the expressiveness, but I can have greater efficiency in interacting with it as well. I don't know what effect that would have on visualization, but in terms of authoring, that's something that I've been thinking about as my fantasy.
I love that. I love that. Jessica, what's your fantastical vision?
Sure. Well, I like Mike's actually, but I have to come up with my own. So I think my underlying idea is boring, but I can make it sound fantastical. So like drawing on, you know, all of the advances in natural language processing and natural language generation, like I really think natural language is sort of becoming this important interface, perhaps even in visualization for how we generate visualizations and how we interpret them. My idea would be that, you know, in the future, visualizations have conversations with you. And in particular, they have conversations to figure out why you care about the data, you know, what kind of decision you're making, what are the stakes of why you care about the data, and then they talk to you about exactly what you can infer and maybe what you should be more careful about. Maybe they let you think through counterfactuals, et cetera. I think that would be useful. Sort of underlying all that and slightly closer to the current time point, I think, you know, I'm a fan of all the work on visualization grammars to make things more declarative. But I think in particular, we have to be pushing towards tasks, and I would say we also have to be pushing towards deeper understanding, or a sort of more structured understanding of tasks as also involving things like stakes. So I think my fantastical version would be that the visualization actually cares why you care, and it's going to help you make the right decision.
Thanks, Jessica. I don't know if there are any Tableau folks in here, but I know that's something that you guys are already thinking about. I'm curious about how far away it is. Duncan?
Yeah, I think probably my vision is kind of the opposite direction of the sort of like the high technology end of visualization, you know, with AI and machine learning and things like that. I'm really interested in kind of pushing the boundaries in the opposite direction and looking at how we can make better data viz with the technology that we already have, and in even simpler technology. And I think the key benefits of taking a low-tech approach to visualization is, you know, it's easier to create, it's cheaper to create, it's more accessible. There's less of a a learning curve for people who want to get into it. And probably most importantly, from my personal perspective, it's lower impact on the world around us. High technology, machine learning, AI requires huge amounts of computing power, and that power has to come from electricity. And in most parts of the world today, that means fossil fuels and carbon emissions. And I think shifting to a lower tech model of data viz would be better for people and better for the planet. I don't think we need more technology to make good visualizations. So yeah, I think probably my fantastical vision is a future where visualization is lower tech, it's more sustainable, it's more accessible, more global, and it has the sound aspect that I've been talking about all the time so far, woven in along with the visuals. I think that focusing in too hard on technology, and I say this as a former technology journalist, has created, honestly, quite a lot of the problems that we're struggling with in the world today. So yeah, my vision is one where visualization primarily helps solve the world's problems rather than causing them.
I love this. Thanks, Duncan. It definitely, I don't think we think about enough like how visualization impacts our society and how we are inadvertently contributing to it. Sheila?
No, I thought I was going to actually talk where Duncan has, and actually my paper this year, my student Fruzen will be presenting it on Wednesday, is all about having more depth in data physicalization using paper with both independent and dependent variables and incorporating interaction in paper, et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, you can see her talk, and I definitely think that there is a place of empowering people through less tech. But in contrast, I think I will actually talk about what me and some of my collaborators talked about last year, with Wesley, Bon, Pierre, Yvonne, Laura, and Petra. We talked about superpowers as an inspiration for visualization. And I think that actually we are at the point where we can actually do that. I mean, so many of the people, in particular the young people in our culture, are really enamored with this notion of having superpowers, and in combination with AI and machine learning and HCI and hardware as well as software, but very much and very importantly, visuals and how visuals integrate into all of these things. We can actually create technologies that make us feel like superheroes. We can create technologies that can see inside our drawers so that when we've lost something, we can just scan over the front instead of having to rummage through all of them and mess them all up. Like building visual technologies that give us superpowers is within reach. We can do it. Many of the kinds of things that we need to do it are available, just not integrated. And one of the very important ways of integrating them is via the visuals.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I am now going to open up to the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and our very helpful student volunteer will run the mic to you. We have one question up here.
Thanks a lot for the amazing discussion. It was very informative. I really liked the thoughts about the sonification. So I really wanted to ask Duncan a question, like how would the sonification deal with accessibility issues, or are they like fundamentally incompatible?
Do you have any particular accessibility issues in mind? Because obviously it's a whole spectrum.
Like hearing impairments? Hearing impairments?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it is more difficult with hearing impairments. There's, a certain amount you could do with vibration, probably, in the way that you feel sound as well as hearing it in your ears. But yeah, absolutely. It's a big drawback of sonification that it's harder for people who are hearing impaired, in the same way that it's a big drawback with visualization that it's harder for people who are visually impaired. So each of these approaches has its difficulties, and that's why I think it's most powerful when you use more than one at the same time, because then you can, it can be more accessible from a broader audience, and it works for people with both sorts of impairments.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Awi from Harvard. So thank you for your wonderful discussion. So I want to start with a statement that I often hear. So it says, visualizations are now more for communication than data analysis. So their supporting argument is that now we have stronger techniques, like we have AI, all those data analytic things, more powerful tools, so that people no longer need to use data visualization for analyze. So, but on the other hand, people do have the eager for the right to know, so they need to use data visualization to get the data, to assess the data. So my question is that, what do you think is the future of data visualization for communication or for data analysis?
Can I speak on that one?
Of course.
I guess so. I think about this a lot, like sort of when do we need visualizations? So there's this, like loosely defined principle in stats called the anthropic principle, which is that, you don't need stats if the signal in your data is like hitting you over the head. Like maybe you just make a graph and you don't have to do any statistical analysis because it's obvious. There's like other problems where the noise is so large relative to the signal in the data that you could do stats, but you're kind of hopeless. And then there's this middle region where we actually want to do statistical analysis. And I think we could ask the same question for visualization. So is there a class of problems that we think visualization alone is sufficient for? Or do we always assume that, when people do visual analysis or when people are communicating visualization, whoever the receiver is going to go off and do further statistical analysis, collect new data, et cetera, to confirm what they think they believe? I think we've been a little bit sort of shied away from this question. We focus on the visualization piece, and we don't necessarily always think about the broader workflow. I will say, I guess, I don't think visualization is going to go away. I think visualization in sort of, and I mean that in a broad sense, like not just visualization, any sort of contextualization of data, so sonification, et cetera, all of these things. I think it's really useful for allowing people to figure out how to bring their prior knowledge and their domain expertise to bear on data. I think we often need to see things or hear things or have things communicated in some sort of format that aligns with our kind of, the way that we think about things data naturally in order to figure out what we can contribute. I do think there's interesting questions, especially as we see more and more interfaces used in modeling settings where the models are more and more complex and black box and hard to interpret, like Viz for ML. There's this sort of question of how do we make sure that if we are building visualization tools that open up the insides of some model and allow some analysts to sort of get insights from visualizations and then make actions directly on a sort of learning pipeline, like how do we make sure that they're actually helping? I think we have to think a lot harder about evaluation. Going forward, I've always been a fan of rigorous evaluation, but I think in particular, as we're trying to analyze huger data sets with bigger models, and we think visualization is helpful for getting the human to add their input to the process, we need to be able to evaluate how much is the human input helping, because when you have some huge space of features, you have some huge sort of model in terms of the complexity, the parameters, et cetera. I think there's increasingly potential, that showing people visualizations, especially when something is a black box as well, and we can't necessarily trust the interpretability methods. Like I think there's a lot of risks where we could, look at data and end up thinking we understand something we don't. So better evaluation, I guess, is my final proposal. But I think that was a great question, very interesting and important.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Jessica. Do any of the panelists have anything else to add?
Well, I would say I don't think that it's which is it better for either or. I mean, I think that, we use, I do think that Viz is all about communication, but words are all about communication, and that doesn't mean that they aren't important in our more decisive reports, precise, legal, etc. And sometimes we have to adjust them to make them as precise as we might need them to be in a particular situation. And sometimes we use them more for pleasure and, different types of communication. And I think that if we let visualization mature, it can go in both of those kinds of directions. That we can get more sure about when we are being precise and when we need to be, and how we want to do that, and when we are communicating and inspiring and opening things up to give people more stuff to think about. So I think that I don't think it's a matter of either or.
I agree with that, if I could add. Yeah. I think it's both. And it's like asking whether writing, is that something for yourself or is that something for other people? I think you're always going to have both, right? You want to be able to externalize some of your cognitive load into a visualization to remember what you're looking at or to understand some pattern in your data. That could be something that you're just doing for yourself. And likewise, if you find something interesting and you want to communicate that, you're going to be using that to present your information, to present your insights, communicate those insights to other people. So it's always going to be both of those things. Maybe one of the challenges is like treating those as separate tasks. Like one is for you to try to surface some pattern in the data. Maybe you don't know necessarily what it's going to show you until you look at it. It's more of an exploratory act. Whereas the other is like you're intentionally trying to communicate something that you've already learned through that analysis. So it's much more of a designing with a specific intent of what you're communicating.
Okay, we have a question on Slido for Duncan. Are there particular low-tech visualization approaches or examples that are especially exciting to you?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, Sheila talked earlier about how we've been doing, we humankind have been doing data viz for thousands of years, carving things into bones and tying knots into ropes and stuff like that. And, church bells, for example, are a great sonification for it's time to go to church. So there's all kinds of historical examples. But when I'm talking about low tech, I'm not necessarily talking about carving. I'm not saying we should all be carving things into bones. I'm really interested by the potential of doing hand-drawn work. And, obviously this is something that Stephanie Posavec and Georgia Lupi have explored a lot in their work. But also it's kind of broader than that. Before Google Maps came along, people would hand draw maps, like directions for people all the time on bits of paper. And most of those were probably less general in the way that Sheila talked about earlier, and therefore probably more effective for the specific audience in question, for that specific task, than something like Google Maps is. I also think that not necessarily all visualizations have to be, interactive. I think, 80-90% of visualization situations can probably be solved with static images. And I use static images a lot in my work. I learned D3, thank you, Mike, for creating it. But honestly, I don't use it in my work in a whole lot of situations, except as a kind of feed in for the static visuals. So I think that, thinking what is the simplest way that I can get this done, like deliver what my audience needs, solve that design problem, is often the way that I go about troubleshooting. And it often means that I then am able to avoid overcomplicating the situation and ending up with a huge amount of technical debt and so on. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Hopefully does. Thank you, Duncan. So we have time for maybe one more question, and you have someone in the back.
So this question is, I'm Shilpi from NOAA. This question is in relation to the comment about not generalizing visualizations, which I thought was really cool. When you're presenting data visualizations live to an audience, for example, in a museum exhibit where you might have people from all different backgrounds, can you recommend any best practices in terms of the content of the visualization as well as presentation style to try to really engage as many people as possible, given that they are coming from such a diversity of background and experience?
It's a great question.
Well, yeah, you've picked a situation that is particularly challenging. I'm actually giving a keynote at VisGuides about best practices considered harmful. No, actually, I don't know that I want to recommend best practices. I think we have to be very careful of the whole notion of best practices, that it's kind of built on the notion that there is a best way of doing it, or that if I have figured out something that works well for me, it's also best for you. I do think that, the way we have got around this in words and in art is by communicating something the way the person who is creating it feels most passionate about it. And that doesn't mean like that a given painting is going to be meaningful for everybody, or that a given poem is going to be meaningful for everybody. But even now, when I've worked with museums or when I go to a museum, you almost never have only one way that the person can, that you're presenting a particular thing. And I think we need to go for richness. Let there be more than one way. Let there be visuals and verbals and sound and tactile and vibration methods and different kinds. I mean, that's what when we go to not so much a museum, but a science world, what they usually do is or what they often do is present us a different way of experiencing a scientific concept that we wouldn't have when in our textbooks or in our classrooms, that we can feel it through temperature variations, or that we can hear it, or that we could experience it in some other kind of way. And I think that we have to recognize our limitations, that there isn't something that is perfect for somebody who relies very heavily on visuals is not going to be perfect for somebody who is visually impaired. We have to recognize that. It's, back to this notion of like that we don't all want to wear uniforms, that a person with a particular taste or a particular body type will probably know where they want to shop, or what kind of how they feel best, and actually they are the best judge of that. It makes it less simple, but it makes the world more rich. And I think we need to let our visualizations take part in the general richness of the world, and accept that there isn't just one way to visualize one data set. Visualize it in as many ways as possible. You have some data thing that you want to have in the museum, and visualize it, sonify it, musify it, do it in as many ways as possible. And don't, like Mike was saying earlier at the beginning, don't eliminate the words because we're using visuals. Try and provide for as many variations of how we are humans and how we experience as humans as we can.
Yeah, these are excellent words to end on. We are running a little bit over time, and I want to be respectful of our panelists' time. We have selected this set of panelists exactly because of their expertise, and they have all are working on things that are a little bit futuristic. I would encourage you to look at some of Jessica Holman's paper, especially Cicero, which is a grammar for looking at responsive visualization. Mike Vostok, as you know, has been working on Observable, and this is a great platform for making our code more shareable and making it easy for other people to edit our code. Sheila has worked on an amazing paper that won Best Paper last year that talks about the superpowers of visualization, and it's a really great and imaginative way for us to think about how visualization could give us superpowers. I also encourage you to check out Duncan's podcast, Loud Numbers. It really dives a lot into sonification and really advocates for how we can add sound to our visualization. With that, I really appreciate again our panelists' time and their expertise and the knowledge that they have embarked on us. Can we please give them a round of applause and thank them? Thank you again, panelists.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for
We're now at the end of VisComm. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next year. We have a Slack channel, so definitely add yourself to our Slack channel so that we can continue these conversations.